Good evening. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us on this New Republic webcast. I'm Michael Tomasky. I'm the editor of the New Republic, and I'm very pleased tonight to be joined by Mary Trump. Mary Trump, author of two best-selling books, and more to the point for tonight's purposes, the great September cover story in the New Republic, our September issue, Donald's Plot Against America. So we're going to talk about that piece. We're going to talk about her new book, which is called Reckoning. And we'll talk maybe a little bit about her first book too. And we'll talk about current events and get her take on the January 6th Commission and other things going on. So let's get to it. Mary Trump, hi.
Hi, it's so good to be here.
It's great of you to join us. Thanks very much. So let's start out by talking about the piece. A great piece, did tremendous traffic for us. Donald's Plot Against America. And this is a piece where you basically just kind of catch people up on your observations on everything that has happened since the publication of your first book, Too Much and Never Enough, which was such a mega bestseller. You start out by describing you sitting at home watching events unfold on January 6th, and then you weave that into a narrative. And the main point of the piece really that you make is something that you call the second big lie. So we all know what the big lie is about the election, the allegedly stolen election. So what's the second big lie?
The seeds for the second big lie were actually planted on January 6th by Donald in his post-insurrection video, which was less than 90 seconds long, I think. And essentially what that's ended up becoming is this narrative on the right that either the insurrection was a deep state thing, and it's the deep state that should be held responsible for it. And that one, I think, is fading actually in favor of the other one, although Republicans are perfectly comfortable toggling back and forth between two contradictory things. The second and probably more disturbing one is that the people who were at the insurrection, who were committing insurrection against our own government, are the good guys. They're the patriots. They're the ones whose voices deserve to be heard. And the rest of us are just making this up to sow division and make the other side look bad, which is, of course, the Republican playbook at this point.
I'm sure you've seen recently the latest phrase is that some of the people under arrest or in custody for their activities on January 6th are actually political hostages.
Yeah. This is what happens when you fail to hold your leaders accountable, because we can't forget that the people probably supporting that idea are insurrectionists themselves. We have at least 10 people in the Senate who tried to commit sedition against our government, and they're still sitting in the Senate. And we have dozens of representatives in Congress who are in the same boat. So it's not surprising. I mean, it might be a little surprising how creative they can be sometimes when they're trying to pull a fast one on the rest of us. But it is, I think it's almost inevitable that these kinds of spins would be happening, considering how desperately the Republican Party needs to keep the truth about January 6th out of public view.
Yeah. And of course, as you write, your uncle needs to keep that truth out of view as well. What are your observations on what his public posture has been in these recent weeks?
It's been interesting to see how he would manage post-Twitter life, really. Yeah. Although it's important to remember a couple of things. Donald's narcissism is so all-consuming that he could literally be one of only 4 people in the room and still think he's the center of the universe and the most important thing and doing the most important things. Yeah. So he doesn't really need social media. He just needs like 2 or 3 people telling him he's great, But I guess the more disturbing thing is that despite the fact that he's had a pretty low profile, as he should have, the the Republican Party's insistence that he remain relevant, that he remain the head of the party, gives him power he wouldn't otherwise have, even when we're not hearing from him that much. They still go down to Mar-a-Lago to kiss the ring. They're still looking for his endorsements. His endorsements, as you know, Michael, still carry a terrible, well, not for him, but for the rest of us, power. Yeah. And he's still having his rallies and getting people sick with COVID. So he's managing it actually better than I thought he would. But again, it's because he's been allowed to remain a player in the game.
Yeah. And let's talk about the Republicans and the way they enable him. And because you spend a lot of time on this in the piece. And I think, one of the big takeaways from the piece to me is that it's not just your uncle, it's the whole party, and the way they behave toward him. So talk about that and how that has changed, or maybe not changed, surprised you or not surprised you in these recent weeks.
The only thing that's changed is their willingness, almost to a person, to go all in with him. There's no pushback anymore. There's no equivocating. They're absolutely 99.9% Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger aside, behind him at every level of government. It's kind of terrifying, but I think this is also the direct result of the fact that Donald actually did teach the Republican Party something. And it's if you're brazen enough, if you push the envelope far enough and nobody stops you, why change anything? And they are following that blueprint. And it's a cause for great concern, because the system's already rigged in their favor with the Electoral College and gerrymandering and the filibuster. But we add voter suppression laws on top of that, and they might be unstoppable, because, again, why shouldn't they go outside of the rules and push through what would be a permanent minority?
And talk a bit about Mitch McConnell. You have some choice words for him in the article.
Yeah, I think Mitch McConnell has been the most destructive force in modern America. And I believe that he's the greatest traitor to this country since Robert E. Lee. And the only difference really because again, Mitch McConnell enabled Donald. Donald is now responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Americans, just as Robert E. Lee was. But I mean, I guess if you could say anything good about Robert E. Lee, at least he did it from outside. He declared war against us, whereas Mitch McConnell is trying to take us down from within. And what's really worrisome is that he's been doing it within the bounds of the system, because he's been, again, using the structure of the government in very cynical ways. He's changed the system. So I guess you can give him credit for that, I suppose, because you can't really charge him with anything. But he, in my view, has been the greatest force in thwarting America from reaching its potential and turning it back. We know that what he's wanted all along is a stacked court. So things like just happened with SCOTUS vis-a-vis the Texas so-called heartbeat law could happen.
Did you think 5 years ago that your uncle could do this, was capable of this, had this power over these people?
I absolutely knew. That? Oh, I'm sorry.
No, did you always somehow suspect that he might have this power, or did this just hit you like a bolt out of the blue?
The second I knew that the election was called for him, I also knew that it was going to be the worst 4 years of this country's life, at least since I've been on the planet. I know him, I've known him forever. He's the same person he was when I last saw him. He's the same person he was when I was growing up. he has no bottom. Whatever he feels is to his benefit, he will do if he can get away with it. Because again, he's a coward. But again, I can't use the word power in connection to him, because he's always given permission. He's always backed up by people with more power than he has, by more intelligence, by more savvy than he has. So he's just sort of bumbling along. The only thing that surprised me, and I'm actually ashamed to admit that it kept surprising me, was the extent to which the Republican Party was going to be okay with it and wasn't going to lift a finger to stop his unbearably destructive 4 years in the Oval Office.
Yeah. Well, you weren't alone in that, that's for sure. Now, you visited the White House once. You write in Too Much and Never Enough. For people who didn't read it, you want to tell that story?
Yeah, it was really weird, because this was in April 2017. I was a basket case because I hadn't recovered from the 2016 election. Not that I have yet, but I really hadn't recovered at that point. But somehow over the last few years, I had developed an actually close relationship with my Aunt Marianne. And remember, I got disinherited, and the last time I had seen all of my aunts and uncles was at their depositions in a lawsuit I brought against them in 2000, because, we're all Trumps after all. So I guess this is how we have relationships with each other. We sue each other. And then for some bizarre reason, I was invited to Ivanka's wedding 9 years later. And that's when Marianne and I started being back in touch. And she invited me because she and my Aunt Elizabeth were celebrating their birthdays at the same time. Marianne's 80th, Elizabeth's 75th. And I felt, as usual in my family, that if I didn't go, it would be really bad for me. But if I did go, it would be completely neutral. Yeah. So I bucked myself up and I went, and it was absolutely surreal to see people are, well, vile and unworthy, inhabiting that house was devastating to me. I had to check out in order to get through it. I was so numb the whole time because I couldn't allow myself to feel much. And I never imagined I'd be at the White House, certainly not under those circumstances. Right. It's beautiful. I will say that, but again, he's totally unworthy of it. So.
And what was your interaction with your uncle like? 2 seconds or?
Well, I kind of avoided him because, again, I hadn't seen him in almost 10 years. So I avoided him while we were doing the tour of the Oval Office and the tour of the upstairs. And it wasn't until we went into the dining room, he was standing by the door. I was the last one in. And he looks at me and he does this. I specifically asked for you to be invited. Mm-hmm. And I laughed because he did not specifically ask me to be invited, but it was so classic Donald. So he needs to make sure that whoever it is has been co-opted just a little bit. Yeah. So you have to give this little micro concession to him, and he's kind of got his hooks in you. But I know better. So I just kind of laughed at him. Yeah. And for the first time in my life, he hugged me, which was just astonishing. And that was pretty much it. We took a picture together at the end, but there wasn't much of substance. Yeah. I just told him, because it was 4 months in, he was already struggling. I just said to him, "Don't let them get you down." And he said, "I won't." Yeah.
And how was the food?
The food was shockingly good. I'm a vegetarian, and they made a special plate for me. And because my grandmother was the worst cook on the planet. The food in that house was just, I'm not entirely sure how we all survived. Right. No offense to Scotland, but she's Scottish. So, vegetables were a challenge. No, the food was fantastic. The wine was amazing because it was real wine. Yeah. Not my family's wine.
Right. Okay, circling back to the article, I want to talk to you a little bit about the Democrats, because you say some things about the Democratic Party in the piece too, and and their response, their sort of how would I describe it? Well, you describe it: aimless, or not, just not aggressive enough response to all that Trumpism has done to the country. Talk about that for a bit.
I'm sorry to say, I don't think the majority of our elected Democrats understand yet what's going on. I'm not sure why. A lot of these people have been around for a long time. I think in some instances, it's because the so-called institutionalists just cannot see beyond the blinders they have on. And they think the rules still matter when, of course, there aren't any, the Republicans don't play by any rules. And if that's the case, there aren't any rules. So not that a situation like this has happened, but whenever there's something going on that seems mystifying to me, I always imagine there must be something going on behind the scenes that we just don't have any access to, or that we're not privy to, that might explain what the deal is. But failing that, it is of deep concern, because the fact that some of them are still trying to make common cause with the Republican Party, that they still believe that bipartisanship is more important than crafting and passing legislation that will actually help the American people, and, by the way, preserve democracy, suggests that they don't understand the serious threat democracy is under. And it also suggests that they don't understand that their counterparts are now willingly part of a party that's a party of fascists.
Of course, they did impeach him twice. Who are some Democrats who you think stood out in those efforts and actually impressed you?
Oh, Jamie Raskin is just extraordinary. Every time I see him, my heart breaks for him, because his son died very shortly before the first or the second impeachment. I've lost all sense of time. But he's a brilliant constitutional scholar. Yeah. So many of them, I have to be honest, to a person, in both impeachments, I can't think of one person who didn't stand out. I think that all of them rose to the occasion, and almost every single Republican didn't, which is why we're where we are now, quite honestly. So now it's more that we have to worry about the Democrats and all Democrats voted unanimously, which was very impressive. And I think it shows, one, how compelling the evidence must have been, and two, how brilliant Nancy Pelosi is. But the fact that Manchin and Sinema and probably others that we don't hear about are still pushing against reform is what really troubles me. The institutionalists who just have either no imagination, or, and this also worries me, they're down with the Republican agenda.
Either that, or they're for whatever hard to identify reason, they're afraid of changing the filibuster. And I don't know. Do you think it's that, or do you think that they actually just don't accord voting rights a very high place in their scheme of things?
Well, I mean, if it's simple, if they're just narrowing it to one issue, then that's a kind of short-sightedness that's going to get us in a lot of trouble, because the filibuster isn't just about ending the filibuster, isn't just about getting through the infrastructure or not the infrastructure, the voting rights stuff. It's about saving democracy. So I guess they're probably saying, well, if we do it, then the Republicans get back into power and they'll do it. Well, of course they're going to do it anyway. So then why don't we do it now and get some value out of it, fix things? And by the way, if we don't, I am not sanguine about Biden's chances in 2024.
Yeah. I want to talk about that in a bit. But, my thought on the filibuster and the Republicans having the majority in the Senate is that, there are going to be things that they're just not going to be able to undo. Like if the Democrats, for example, passed a minimum wage, which they haven't managed to do because that takes 60 votes. So you need some Republicans for that. But if the Democrats manage to pass a minimum wage and the Republicans want to go undo that, I think that's pretty hard to undo. It's really popular, and public opinion does still matter. We're a corrupted democracy, but we're still enough of a democracy that public opinion does matter. If the Democrats pass this reconciliation bill and expand, Medicare to include dental and vision, or they, do some kind of universal pre-K, I think things like that are going to be really hard for the Republicans to do, because undoing those things would be really unpopular. What do you think?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And we've seen that. We've seen that with Social Security.
Yeah.
The idea to privatize
Obamacare.
Oh, yes, the Affordable Care Act. They tried 700 times to kill it. And, nobody wants it killed. The only people who actually do are people who think that Obamacare and the ACA are different things.
Yeah, right.
So they want to keep the Affordable Care Act. They just want to get rid of Obamacare. Or people who are so ignorant, they actually carry signs that said, "Keep your government off of my Social Security."
Yeah,
Oops.
right.
So you're absolutely right. And this is what I've been saying for a while now. How do we change things? How do we get to the point where some of those 74 million people kind of come back into the fold?
Yeah.
Well, we govern. We make their lives better.
Yeah.
We prove to them that government isn't some hostile foreign entity out to get them.
Yeah.
We teach them that, one, it could be a force for real good in their lives. How many people were lifted out of poverty because of that COVID relief bill? How many more people could be lifted out of poverty with this reconciliation package?
Yeah.
That matters to people. And we can also then help them understand that the government is us. It's not,
Bingo.
We're represented by people, but it is us who are being represented.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to do more current events, but I want to give you a few moments to talk about the new book, The Reckoning, Our Nation's Trauma and Finding a Way to Heal. And sharp-eyed viewers can see it back there on your shelf between you and your guitar, right above your thumb. Very good. Well pointed. Okay, so what is our nation's trauma?
Initially, I was thinking of it strictly in very literal terms, the traumas we were going to be facing once and if we ever emerged from COVID.
Yeah.
I was thinking about just the horrible mental health crisis that we were going to be facing and are facing and will continue to face. But then I realized that I didn't think that was going to be that helpful, because everybody's having such different experiences and such different reactions. So I thought it would be much more useful to figure out how we got here in the first place. Mm-hmm. How did this country get to a point where we were so vulnerable to weak, corrupt, ignorant, cruel leaders like Donald? How did we get to the point where we were so susceptible to the spin and the propaganda that's being thrown at us on an almost constant basis? And how did we get to the point where so many of us were willing to accept the fact that one of our two major political parties has as one of its major platforms white supremacy? So I went back and I realized that the two main threads that run from the beginning till now, and I think do help explain how Donald got where he is, one, that we never, ever hold our powerful leaders accountable, ever. If we don't hold Robert E. Lee accountable, I mean, how much worse does somebody need to be? And worse than that, he was actually pardoned by Gerald Ford. So the worst traitor to this country ever, a man responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Americans, and a man who tortured and enslaved other human beings, got let off the hook, has universities named after him, and was pardoned by a Republican president in the early 70s. Yeah. And by the way, Jimmy Carter pardoned Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy. So if somebody like him isn't going to be held accountable, I mean, why would anybody think that they can't get away with whatever they want? And Donald, I guess intuitively understands that, because he's been getting away with stuff his entire life. The other thing that I mentioned is the strain of white supremacy that's never gone away. And at certain points through the last 250 years has resurfaced. And we're at this point right now where it is very much in the fore. And when you have a candidate for the presidency who is campaigning on racism openly, and he still gets 74 million votes, that I think that says a lot.
You think this is one of the higher watermarks in recent American history for that kind of open racism? I mean, it seemed to be.
I think it's up there, especially given the fact that most people would have thought that things were improving. We had a Black president, but that also exposed the deep hatreds that people still have, their deep insecurities, and their absolute need to hold on to their white privilege in a way I don't think I've seen in my lifetime.
Yeah, you write about all that very well in the piece, by the way, just the people's anxiety about their privilege and losing it. And that's a very important psychological piece of all this.
Yeah, it is fascinating. And it is also something that goes back to when this country still enslaved people. Rich whites knew that they needed to co-opt white working class people because white working class people had much more reason to make common cause with Black workers. I'm sorry, Reconstruction, because obviously after Southern Blacks were freed. And the only thing they had to offer was privilege. And that's become so ingrained in the white Americans' experience that it feels like something they're owed, and it feels like something that's impossible for them to let go of. And a lot of that is held in place through fear. And Donald, again, I don't like saying he's good at anything, but he's quite expert at, one, finding weaknesses in other people, and two, scaring them and using that fear to create in them this sense of grievance and anger.
Yeah. Moving back to the news, I'm very interested in your thoughts on the 1/6 Commission, the January 6th Commission, and I guess your hopes for it. The most recent maneuver, of course, is Kevin McCarthy trying to block the tech companies from preserving those phone records. What are your thoughts on that? And just broadly, what do you hope this commission uncovers and tells the country?
I mean, as far as McCarthy's concerned, I believe that's obstruction of justice. No, that what he did was illegal, and of course he will suffer no consequences.
Right.
So there we go. You know, what are my hopes? Because I'm not entirely sure what the resulting findings of the commission can accomplish. Listen, I think finding out the truth is incredibly important, and laying out the narrative to the American people is incredibly important. But without teeth, without consequences, paging Merrick Garland, like, could you please put some muscle behind this effort? And I think that's got to be the most worrisome part of this. I'm deeply grateful that there is a January 6th commission. Yeah. It's necessary. And there should be one no matter what the Department of Justice is doing. But the fact that there's no public signaling that the Justice Department is actively pursuing information about who incited this insurrection, who was involved in it, who funded it, who benefited from it, et cetera, concerns me greatly. Again, I'm so concerned about everything because there's so much to be concerned about. Yeah. But it's sort of like the thing with, not to just very quickly to go on a brief aside, as soon as SCOTUS ruled that they weren't going to interfere with a just horrific and what is the word, medieval law in Texas, I know Merrick Garland couldn't do anything. They need to be very careful about he should have said something though, because people need to hear from him. People need to believe that he is righting the wrongs. And so far, he's made a lot of missteps. I mean, for God's sakes, he's representing Donald against E. Jean Carroll because he was defaming her, according to the Department of Justice, in the course of his duties as the president. I mean, it's disheartening.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that the Garland Justice Department bought the Bill Barr Justice Department argument, specious argument on that front, was pretty surprising. And probably the single lamest move he's made, I think, in my view.
Yeah. Unless, again, he's not doing anything about the insurrection. Then that would be.
Yeah.
We don't know.
I'm Michael Tomasky, the editor of the New Republic. We're talking, of course, to Mary Trump, author of the New Republic cover piece in the September issue, Donald's Plot Against America, also author of the new book, The Reckoning. Great book. And of course, her mega best-selling first book, Too Much and Never Enough. I want to make a couple of little announcements here while we're just beyond the halfway point. Next week, I'll be hosting one of these on foreign policy. We have another great piece in the September issue by Jordan Michael Smith. It's kind of a 9/11 20th anniversary piece in which he asks a lot of people in the foreign policy establishment whether they've learned anything in the last 20 years of these American misadventures. And it's a terrific piece. I recommend it to you very highly. And he'll be joined. I'll be moderating. Jordan will be there. Be joined by Heather Hurlbert of New America and Madiha Afzal of Brookings Institution, both really good guests. I hope you'll tune into that one as well. The other thing I want to say is on our website right now at tnr.com, you can come vote in our first reader survey, maybe ever, at least in a while, at least under my editorship, for the worst right-wingers in America. It's just 20 questions. One of the categories even is worst Trump. Mary is not, of course, among the choices.
Thank you.
And so please come to our site anyway and read the great content, but come to our site and do take our readers survey. Who are the worst right-wingers in America? And the answers will be revealed in our November issue. Okay, back to talking to Mary. What's your speculation, your latest speculation about whether your uncle might run in 2024?
Yeah, as you can imagine, I get that question fairly often.
Yeah.
And my opinion on that has evolved since the election, but so too has the anger that it's a question that actually is still relevant. Like, I'm not angry that you asked the question. I'm angry that we have to ask and answer that question.
Right.
After November 7th, I believe he wouldn't, because he's so badly beaten by President Biden. That loss was so humiliating. And not just because of the 8 million vote margin, but because Republicans not only performed expectation, they outperformed him. So he didn't even have anybody to blame. Although, of course, he can always find somebody, but it was doled out to him. So I figured that to kind of assuage his narcissistic injury, he would pretend he'd won, and then use that to pretend to run, also as a grift, because as we know, he's raising a lot of money.
Yeah.
I've changed I don't know, but I now think it's much more likely for a couple of different reasons. First of all, he's still the head of the Republican Party. And as we discussed earlier, he's still relevant and he still has power, which, again, if the Republicans had told him to shut up after November 7th and accepted Biden's win, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Yeah. The other thing, and this actually worries me more, is that the Republicans are trying mightily to make it more difficult, if not impossible, for certain kinds of people to vote in almost every state. They only need 3. So if they can enact the kinds of voter suppression laws we're seeing in Georgia and Arizona and Pennsylvania, that's all they need. They just need those 3 states. They can, if they can swing it, and also if they get a majority in the House again and they can gerrymander more districts, Donald would actually get the message, and I think he'd be right, that if he ran, he couldn't lose. So hopefully he will be either under indictment or, doing depositions full time or in prison or something. But if that's not the case, I mean, why wouldn't he? He needs the protection of the Oval Office to keep him out of all of the trouble he's in, which is exactly what happened for the first 4 years. Right. And the reason it makes me so angry is because he shouldn't be allowed to run again. Yeah. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment says that people who committed insurrection against the country can hold public office again. Yeah. Why wasn't that invoked? Why that could still be invoked now? Another reason to get rid of the filibuster. So, and the other thing, I read this recently, is that if he does declare that he's running, does that mean that the Justice Department can't discuss whether or not he's under investigation? Because that's tradition.
Yes.
So it gives him another advantage. So I think I would hope that if the media do ask that question, which again is a fair question, if also an infuriating one, yeah. That they follow what that means. They follow up with what that means and explain to people what that means, because it's another reason we need to hold people accountable. How is it possible that a man who kidnapped children and put them in concentration camps, a man who was openly racist and pro-fascist, a man who's directly responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Americans through malicious and willful inaction because he thought it was a good political strategy, how is he, forget about allowed to run again, how is he able to roam free?
Boy, I see some clips of him in the early days of the virus saying some of the things he said, and it's just hard to believe we lived through that.
Yeah, a lot of us didn't.
Yeah, no, that's quite true. That's quite true. I wonder about the Republicans vis-a-vis him in 2024. By appearances, they really want him to run and they're on board and so on. I wonder, though, if any of them really kind of don't want all that trouble and would just prefer to go back to a normal kind of Republican. Or do they think, well, a normal kind of Republican doesn't get 74 million votes and doesn't get these rallies and doesn't get people worked up like this. So maybe they want him with all the baggage, if they even see it as baggage. What do you think?
I think for purely narcissistic reasons, people like Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley and Tom Cotton don't want him to run because it prevents them from running. And they are arrogant and delusional enough to think that they have the same kind of charisma and can, parlay that into a victory. But generally speaking, I think the party, as it's proven time after time, is perfectly happy to keep him around, not because they like him, but because he's effective and he's achieving things that it never would have occurred to them to try to achieve. Mm-hmm. So I think they understand. One, look, he'll be 78, so it's not like he'll be around forever. But two, if they can get him back into the White House again in 2024, then they win. They win forever. American democracy is over. Mitch McConnell gets his fascistic theocratic apartheid state. And, the rest of us have to, I don't know what we have to do. But it would be devastating and it would be the end of the American experiment. And again, this is why the Democrats need to wake up and start seeing it in these terms. I mean, I'm not the only person saying this. There are a lot of people out there who know a lot more about this stuff than I do who are saying it. So, and the other thing I just want to get back to that you mentioned, does the Republican Party just want to get back to being the normal Republican Party? And my answer to that is emphatically no, because they have shown themselves to be interested in nothing but power. And this is how they're going to get it.
Yeah. Let's take some questions from people tuning in here. Well, this is from somebody who identified him or herself only by number, not name. But does Donald Trump respond to the things you write?
No. I mean, maybe, but I don't know. I mean, obviously, he responded to the first book. Yeah. They sued me again. That's what we do.
Yeah.
And by the way, I'm suing them now, so yeah. It's all coming for full circle.
Yeah.
And he did make some statements, but I think he does not like to go after women who intimidate him. I think I intimidate him, and I'm in good company, so I'm really cool with that. So, and also now I think he's so shielded from everything. I don't even know if he knows that there is a second book out right now.
That would be kind of funny.
It would be.
But I can believe it. Yeah. Jean asks, does Donald really believe that the election was stolen, or is he just an amazing con artist?
You know, this is one of the fascinating things about Donald. Yeah. Both things can be true simultaneously.
Yeah.
You can tell, or it's really easy for me to tell when he's lying. But he tells the lie often enough, especially if there's an emotional need attached to it. Yeah. He begins to believe his own lies. Right. I'm certain that by now he absolutely believes that the election was stolen from him and he's the winner. And because psychologically, it's impossible for him not to believe that. So it's quite something. He's literally the only person I've ever met who can gaslight himself. It's quite a skill.
Let's see what else we have. Mary, thank you for your time tonight and your insight. What do you see as the global consequences of Donald and the GOP not being held accountable? This woman, Andrea, lives in Toronto, and they are having their own consequential federal election in less than 2 weeks' time. Many Canadians fear the same sort of dangerous slide to the far right that America had in 2016. Do you see that kind of global consequence to him? I mean, certainly we see a number of leaders around the world who are Trump-like.
Well, for 4 years, they were emboldened by him. They were championed by him. He befriended them, while completely ignoring and weakening the Western alliance. So I sort of feel like the recall election in California is similar to, what happens in 2022, 2024 federally. If, California is the largest economy and the most populated state in this country. If California goes red, it's going to affect the rest of the country. Yeah. If America becomes an autocracy, that's going to have massive global implications because it gives people permission. And that's one of the worst things Donald does, is he gives people permission to be their absolutely worst selves. And if he's not held accountable, it's not simply that he gets to run again or might run again, which is bad enough, especially if the worst case scenario happens. It's that he's allowed to have a platform. And that's what he should never have been allowed to run in 2020. He should never have been treated as a normal candidate in 2020. And that's what the mainstream media did, because like nature, they abhor a vacuum and they need to normalize everything. So, and also probably worse than all of that is that it lays out a roadmap to future Republicans who want to achieve what Donald almost achieved, but didn't quite.
Yeah. Here's an interesting question from Cindy, which is not about your uncle or the Republican Party, but it's a very interesting question that I myself would be interested in your thoughts on this. One of the scariest things is how ordinary people feel compelled to threaten the safety of teachers, healthcare leaders, political opponents, and anyone who gets in the way of their radical ideology. Do you feel personally threatened? How can the country move beyond the destructiveness of this situation?
I don't. I've never felt threatened, honestly. In a weird way, this is actually really weird, but I also think it's true. My relationship to him protected me, even from his most fanatical followers, because even they weren't going to cross that family line, you know?
Yeah.
But as for the other thing, it is so disturbing. I mean, this country is losing its mind. And once again, it's this virulent, unrelenting, cruel minority of people who don't seem to care at all about other human beings. And I think that's one of the most diabolical things Donald did to this country, among the many. He divided us at a time we most needed to be united. Any sane, slightly empathetic leader would have brought us all together during COVID and created the situation in which us, America, was against them, the virus. And instead, he made it us, his followers, against the rest of us. And I think that's one of the reasons we're seeing the meltdowns and the insane levels of white privilege and these are brown shirts showing up at school board meetings with zip ties. And it just reminds me of that saying, an armed society is a polite society. No, it's not. It's a society in which those of us who don't feel the need to carry semi-automatic weapons to the grocery store are constantly feeling threatened by those people who do feel the need to carry semi-automatic weapons to the grocery store. So they're just like Donald, trying to bully their way to the outcome they want. And it's not going to end with masks. It's not going to end with denying a woman's right to choose. We're just at the beginning of this if it's allowed to continue.
And all these unvaccinated and in some cases unmasked children going off to schools now, and governors like DeSantis and Abbott saying the things they're saying, dictating the things they're dictating. It's just, there are, on this list of questions before me on my screen, there are a few versions of this, but I wonder the same thing myself every day. Just like, how do we fix this? How do you talk to people who just won't pay attention to these basic facts and who think their freedom includes the freedom to get other people sick?
You don't. I said the same thing before the election when people asked me, well, what do we do to convince people who say they're going to vote for Donald? I'm like, don't waste your time. Talk to people who still have an open mind. Talk to people who believe in democracy. Talk to people who believe in science. Because right now, they are not reachable. Think about the people. I mean, one, I just think how bankrupt their lives must be that they think it's worth their while to go to a school board meeting and threaten the lives of teachers. It's just because the teachers want to keep their children safe. It's just quite something. But right now, as I said earlier, I think the only short-term, it's not a solution, but the only short-term strategy is for the Democrats and President Biden to pass legislation that is significantly and palpably going to make people's lives better. The real solution is a very long-term one, and that involves making sure that we teach our children civics. And I don't mean civics as some separate course you take your junior year in high school. I mean civics from the time they're in first grade, and they understand not just what government is and how it works, but how it's part of their lives, how elections affect them, how policies affect them. So it's something that matters to them in a real day-to-day way. And it's not just some, oh yeah, I don't know what the Electoral College is, or whatever, or this is,
Hmm.
when people vote. I mean, that they understand things like voter suppression and gerrymandering and why they're bad, and or on the positive side, how the way government works when it works well is a positive force in their lives, and it's important that they pay attention. So there's that. We need to start teaching critical thinking, because apparently teachers have so much extra time now that they're not teaching critical race theory,
Yeah.
which they weren't doing anyway.
Right.
And we need to teach, this might be among the most important things, we need to teach media literacy, because we're bombarded by propaganda 24 hours a day. And it's getting harder and harder for a certain segment of the population to distinguish truth or facts from fantasy. And, when there are people who actually believe that that Hillary Clinton was running a child pornography ring in a pizza place, in the basement of a pizza place that didn't have a basement, like, they were more willing to believe that than they were willing to believe that that wasn't the case.
Yeah.
We clearly need to start educating people in all of those ways, because otherwise it's just going to keep getting worse. And I think the last 4 years have borne that out.
I'll say
5 years,
yeah.
actually.
And what would you advise people who ask you, and there are several questions like this on this list of questions, with your success and the power of your words, people look to you. What would you advise people do, A, to stay sane, and B, to try and have some kind of small impact on the Democrats, on the Attorney General, on the political system?
Yeah, what's amazing is that I got that question a year ago.
Yeah.
And I never would have imagined that we were still in a place where we needed to figure out how to stay sane. Because, I would have thought we would have been completely done with COVID by now, but I was wrong. How do we say? I think the most important thing we need to do is stay connected, which can be hard, but it's really important. The other thing that's important is find something that kind of gives you joy, or at least helps you pass the time in a way that feels good or productive, like playing the guitar or getting better at a sport, whatever it could be. And the other thing is know when you need to tap out and know that it's okay. I feel like we're in this tag team situation.
Yeah.
It's a marathon. Sometimes it's a sprint. Mostly it's an endurance thing. We can't be tuned in all the time. And I think it's hard to look away because we're all so worried about where this country is heading, but we need a break. So if you can recognize that and, be among people who understand that and support it, then that's really important. Yeah. In terms of what to do, listen, even if it's hard to stay up to date with everything that's going on, and I know it is, I feel it. I'm stressed out all the time because Michael, we can't stop paying attention, and it can be debilitating sometimes. But if you can take some time away, you can still be proactive. Start registering people to vote. The only way the Democrats win in 2022 is if we vote in numbers that we've never seen before, because we're at such a disadvantage between gerrymandering and these voter suppression bills, et cetera. That's a great thing to do. It also puts you in touch with people and like-minded people. It gets you out there, wear a mask, be vaccinated, but it gets you out there, and it's productive and it's positive. It's so easy to get mired in the negativity because there's so much of it. And if I said this to a friend of mine, it's a really, really difficult time to be a person with empathy right now. Yeah. Technically, the Texas law doesn't affect me at all. My heart is breaking for every single woman and girl in Texas who's in a situation where they will be affected by it. But you can't feel that all the time. So just, do something positive and that has consequences, but that doesn't feel like it's tied up in the day-to-day horrors we're living through.
So speaking of all that, you took a very extraordinary step along those lines when you decided to write your first book. And you had to know, as you made that decision, that it was going to be a firestorm. It was going to be controversial. You were going to sell a lot of books maybe, but you were going to be very heatedly attacked by a lot of other people. And that once you made that commitment, your life was going to be different, probably for the rest of your life. Do you see it that way? Or do you want to go back to your, 2016, 2017, 2018 life at some point? Or are you now like fully in the fight for as far as ahead as you can see?
Well, first of all, I'm being completely honest here. Right before my book was published, the only thing I wanted was for me to make my advance back. I had no idea, none whatsoever, what was heading my way at all. And quite honestly, for the first 2 weeks, I couldn't talk because I was under a restraining order. Yeah. But for the first month, the only questions I got were about the SATs and Donald's making a crude comment about my appearance. So, I didn't really think people were going to get it. But, thankfully they eventually did. It's changed. Well, COVID has made it kind of difficult to gauge how much it's changed and the ways in which it's changed. But clearly my life has changed forever. And honestly, I'm so okay with that because I wasn't doing well in 2016, 2017, and 2018. Mm-hmm. It's really difficult to feel helpless. Mm-hmm. And, making the decision to work with the New York Times, first of all, and hand over the 40,000 pages of documents that I had from that old lawsuit that helped them write that absolutely extraordinary piece of investigative reporting. Yeah. Gave me this sense that I can make a difference. And in writing the book, I eventually felt the same way. And I wouldn't trade that for anything.
Yeah. Interesting. Our hour is almost up, but let's, we've had a lot of doom and gloom. Let's try to end on an upbeat note. I mean, the subtitle of your new book does say something about finding a way to heal. So what's that about? How do we find that way? And what are you trying to do to help that?
Well, first, and I mean, this is sort of connected to what I was just talking about. I'm extraordinarily lucky to have a platform now, and I feel obligated. I feel responsibility and obligation in a good way. I mean, I don't, I'm just so grateful to be in this position to help people understand what's going on, hopefully to help people feel better about what they might be experiencing. And one thing that's incredibly important is that it's hard to believe this is still the case, but in this country, we treat mental health as a luxury, and mental illness is still treated as if it's a moral failing. It's still something people aren't comfortable talking about openly. That needs to stop. And that's why it's very important for me, especially under the circumstances, for people to know that I have complex PTSD. The election of 2016 triggered me in a way I'd never been triggered in my life. I had to go away from my home and my child to get treatment for a couple of months. It was so bad. And there's nothing to be ashamed of. And being able to be open and honest about that is a huge step towards healing, towards getting help, towards understanding that so many people, especially after the last 1.5/5 years, are in the same boat and are feeling the same kind of despair and helplessness. We can help each other. And I think the more open we are about it, the more we can mobilize the government to provide the services that people need and the education people need, so they can grasp what's happening to them, because not that I'm happy I have PTSD, but one of the advantages of having it before COVID struck, or before the election of 2016, and certainly COVID, was that I understood what my symptoms looked like, felt like. I understood when I was being triggered. But there are people who don't have that knowledge. And the more of us who are out there talking about it and expressing the need for help at the local, school, state, and federal level, the better. I think President Biden should create a cabinet position dealing exclusively with the mental health crisis caused by COVID, and it should be permanent. So I think, and the other thing that again, I just want to reemphasize is that despite what Donald did, we are not divided. There are so many of us who feel the same way. There's so many of us who want other people to do better. There are so many of us who want this country to be a country where kindness is not weakness, it's strength. There's so many of us who believe that there is real good in other people and in an American government that understands what democracy is. So that's what I would say.
There are more of us. There really are. Folks, I want to thank you all for tuning in and joining us and staying with us for this full hour. I, again, am Michael Tomasky. Think about joining me next Tuesday to talk about 9/11 and foreign policy over the last 20 years, also at 7 p.m. Also, please think about going to TNR.com, doing our worst right-winger survey, and just reading around generally. So thank you all. But most of all, thanks to Mary Trump. Her new book is The Reckoning. Mary, it's been a great hour. It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael. This was fantastic. Really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night.